Hello, thank you for joining us for today's video. We hope everyone has a happy and safe Halloween. If you're looking for something spooky to watch this Halloween, I highly recommend checking out our other channel, Paranormally Listed. We have 2 videos about killers who were haunted by their victims. In another video, we look at 3 creepy murder houses that are supposedly haunted. In yet another video, we look at some ghosts that supposedly haunt Hollywood. We'll have a link to 3 of these videos at the end of this video. Before we get into today's video, we want to bring you a word from our wonderful sponsor, June's Journey. I don't know about you, but I love good puzzles and mysteries. That's why I love June's Journey. It's an incredible, free to download hidden object game. June's Journey takes place in the roaring 1920s, and you go through an exciting murder mystery. June Parker's sister and brother-in-law have been murdered, and she's trying to solve the crime, plus uncover her family's secrets. Not only is the story excellent, but the gameplay is exciting too. Each level has beautifully crafted scenery, and there are objects hidden in them. The quicker you find the objects, the more points you get. I really enjoyed the story in the game. It's not often that you find that high caliber of a story in a free to download game. But of course, finding the objects is a lot of fun too. I look forward to playing the game at the end of the day when I'm lying on the couch and watching a good crime thriller on TV. I think you'll really enjoy June's Journey as well, so you should download it today. Download June's Journey for free by clicking on the link below in the description. June's Journey is available on Android and iOS mobile devices and on PC through Facebook Games. Number 3. Taylor Van Diest. Armstrong is a small city in middle southern British Columbia, Canada. In 2011, it was home to about 4,800 people. 18-year-old Taylor Van Diest lived there with her mother and twin sister. Taylor had recently graduated from high school. In school, she played in the band. She loved playing the games Fruit Slice and Solitaire. She was a fan of horror movies, and one of her favorite nights of the year was Halloween. On Halloween night in 2011, Taylor and her friends decided to go trick-or-treating one last time. She left home on foot at about 6:30 p.m. to meet her friends. She was dressed as a zombie. As she walked, she sent a text message to her boyfriend that read, "Creeped on." Shortly after that, she stopped responding to text messages. When Taylor didn't arrive at the meeting spot, her friends drove around looking for her. After about 90 minutes of searching and finding no trace of her, they called her family. Around the same time, some strangers called her family from her cell phone. They had found her phone near the railroad tracks that run through the city. Taylor's family reported her missing to the police, and then they searched the railroad tracks. They found Taylor unconscious and barely alive beside the tracks. Her head was resting on a metal pipe. She was rushed to the hospital. Sadly, 18-year-old Taylor Van Diest did not regain consciousness and died a few hours after arriving at the hospital. 3 days later, the pathologist did an autopsy. He determined that Taylor had been struck on the head 6 times with a blunt object. However, he could not determine if the pipe her head was resting on was the weapon. She also had a broken finger, which indicates that she tried to defend herself from being struck. After being beaten, the killer strangled her with a thin ligature like a shoelace or a necklace. However, the blows to her head, one of which fractured her skull and caused brain damage, was the cause of death. There were no signs of sexual assault. Unfortunately, the police didn't have much in the way of suspects. Taylor Van Diest was well liked and didn't have any enemies. The police believe she was killed by a random stranger who saw her walking alone and decided to attack her. A few weeks after the murder, the police got a break in the case. They found the killer's DNA under one of Taylor's fingernails. A match to the DNA was found, but it didn't reveal the killer's identity. The DNA was matched to a sexual assault that happened 6 years earlier in April 2005 in Kelowna, British Columbia. Kelowna is about 45 miles north of Armstrong. The police had a sketch of the man and made it public. Eventually, the police received over 1,250 tips. At least one of the tips suggested looking at 26-year-old Matthew Forrester. The problem was that when the police got the tip, they couldn't find Matthew. So they started monitoring his parents' phone. His parents lived in Cherryville, British Columbia, which is about 45 miles east of Armstrong. Matthew's father, Stephen, talked to Matthew on the phone and advised him on how to evade the police. It turned out that Matthew was halfway across the country in Collingwood, Ontario. Collingwood is a popular ski destination north of Toronto. On April 4, 2012, 5 months after Taylor's murder, Matthew was arrested in Collingwood. He was charged with Taylor's murder, and he was charged in connection with a sexual assault that happened in April 2005. Matthew was also charged with several crimes regarding a home invasion that happened in April 2004 in Cherryville, where a man in a mask assaulted a 19-year-old woman. Matthew's father, Stephen, was also charged with being an accessory after the fact. Matthew Forrester went to trial for Taylor's murder in March 2014. Matthew claimed that he came across Taylor and she agreed to have consensual sex. However, there was a scuffle and she fell and hit her head on the pipe. He panicked and fled. The prosecution had DNA evidence that linked him to the crime scene. Taylor's blood was also found in the pickup truck Matthew was driving at the time of the murder. The pathologist also testified that Taylor was struck 6 times and strangled. The trial lasted nearly 2 weeks, and then the jury deliberated for an afternoon and a morning. Matthew Forrester was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole for 25 years. A month later, Matthew's father, Stephen, pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Matthew's lawyer appealed the conviction, citing that the jury was given incorrect instructions. In March 2017, the British Columbia Court of Appeals agreed with the appeal and granted Matthew a new trial. Instead, in June 2018, he pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder. He was given a life sentence with a chance of parole after 17 years. Matthew Forrester never went to trial for the April 2004 home invasion or the April 2005 sexual assault. He'll be able to apply for parole on April 4th, 2029. Number 2. The Kungs. In the autumn of 1984, 35-year-old Dennis Kung and his 29-year-old wife, Edna, lived in northeast Toronto, Ontario, Canada, with their 3 children, 5-year-old Sylvia, 2-year-old Lisa, and a 1-month-old baby boy who had yet to be named. Dennis had immigrated to Canada from China when he was 3 years old with his family. They first settled in Newfoundland. At some point, Dennis was in Montreal and he met Edna. In 1979, Dennis, Edna, and several other family members settled in Toronto, and Dennis started working for Canada Post. Dennis went to work on the night of October 30th, 1984. He finished his shift at 7 a.m. on Halloween and came home. Late that afternoon, Dennis's brother and mother came over for dinner. They made a disturbing discovery and called the police. 29-year-old Edna Kung was on the couch in the living room. A plastic bag had been put over her head and a skipping rope was tied around her neck. In the upstairs bedroom, all 3 children were dead in their beds. Plastic bags had been tied around their heads. In the master bedroom was 35-year-old Dennis Kung's body. There were pills and pill bottles scattered throughout the room. The medical examiner determined that Dennis died from a drug overdose. The police also found a note, but they did not disclose the contents of the note. Everyone who knew the family said that they were quiet but friendly. They didn't think that the family was having any problems. Neither Dennis nor Edna drank, did drugs, or gambled. At the time of the murders, Dennis was under a doctor's care for depression and anxiety. One odd thing that the police noted was that Edna's body showed no signs of a struggle. The police believe it was possible that she and her husband had made a death pact. That evening, after the Kung's neighbors found out what had happened, they kept children who were trick-or-treating away from the area. Number 1. Shirley Lynette Ledford. On the morning after Halloween in 1979, a jogger in Sun Valley, California made a horrifying discovery. They found the nude, dead, mutilated body of a teenage girl. The medical examiner determined that she had died a brutal death. She had been bound and gagged with construction tape. One of her elbows had been shattered from repeated blows with a blunt object, and her skin had been torn. She had been stabbed in the ears with an ice pick. She had also been sexually assaulted. Finally, she had been strangled to death with a metal coat hanger. The police determined that she was 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford, who lived in Sunland, California. She was last seen the night before when she went to a Halloween party. She left the party to hitchhike home. Unfortunately, the police had very little evidence to go on. A few weeks passed, and then the police got a tip from an attorney. The attorney said that one of his clients came to him with a disturbing story. His client was friends with a 31-year-old man named Roy Norris. Norris had bragged about raping and murdering several young women. The police then investigated Norris's background. He was born in February 1948 in Greeley, Colorado. He had dropped out of high school when he was 17 and joined the Navy. He went to Vietnam for 4 months but never saw any action. In November 1969, Norris had his first run-in with the law. He had tried to rape a woman in her car. He was released on bail. Shortly afterward, he was discharged from the Navy because he had psychological problems. In May 1970, when he was 22, he attacked a woman on the San Diego State University campus. He struck her in the head with a rock and slammed her head into the sidewalk several times. The woman survived the brutal assault and Norris was arrested. He was deemed a mentally disordered sex offender and placed in a state hospital. He spent about 5 years in the hospital. He was released in 1975 because the doctors thought he was no longer a danger to society. But 3 months after his release, he raped a woman and strangled her with a scarf. The woman survived the attack. In 1976, Norris was convicted of forcible rape and he was sent to California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. He served a little more than 2 years and he was released on parole in January 1979. The detectives decided to follow Norris around and see if he did anything to violate his parole. A few weeks later, on November 20th, 1979, they caught him selling marijuana and they arrested him. Norris was brought in for questioning He started confessing to several kidnappings, rapes, and murders. But he told the police he wasn't alone when he committed these crimes. He had a partner, 39-year-old Lawrence Whitaker. Whitaker was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in September 1940. He was adopted as an infant. When he was a child, his family moved around a lot. Like Norris, Whitaker dropped out of high school when he was 17. Whitaker was first arrested that same year in Long Beach, California for auto theft, hit and run, and evading arrest. He spent less than 2 years in California's Youth Authority. Shortly afterward, he was convicted of transporting a stolen car over state lines. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison. He was released early for good behavior. In December 1960, he was arrested in Los Angeles, California after robbing a bank. The following spring, he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years of prison. He was released in 1963 after serving 2 years. The following year, he violated his parole and he was sent back to prison. He was paroled again 2 years later in 1966 when he was 26. Then, in 1967, he was arrested for suspicion of theft and leaving the scene of an accident. Another 5 years were tacked onto his sentence. But he was released in 1970 after serving just 3 years. He would not stay out in the streets for very long. In March 1971, Whitaker was arrested for burglary. In October 1971, he was convicted and sentenced to 6 months to 15 years. In 1974, he was out of prison once again. One day, shortly after he was released, Whitaker went to a grocery store and shoplifted some meat. After he walked out of the store, an employee confronted him and Whitaker stabbed him. He was arrested and charged with assault with intent to commit murder. He was convicted and sent to California's men's colony. That is where he met Roy Norris. The two men had an instant connection. They considered each other soulmates. They bonded over fantasies of raping, torturing, and murdering teenage girls. They even made plans to commit murders once they were both released. Whitaker was released first in November 1978. He purchased a cargo van he called the Murder Mac. Norris was released in January 1979. Shortly after they were both released, they met up and finalized their plans on how they would kidnap and murder teenage girls. They decided to take their victims to an isolated area in the San Gabriel Mountains. They committed their first murder on June 24, 1979. They kidnapped 16-year-old Cindy Schaefer near Redondo Beach. They duct taped her mouth and bound her wrists and ankles with duct tape. Then they drove out to the area in the San Gabriel Mountains. They took turns raping her. Then they strangled her to death with a wire clothes hanger. They tied the wire with a pair of pliers. Once she was dead, they threw her body into a canyon. A few weeks later, on July 8th, they picked up 17-year-old Andrea Hall, who was hitchhiking on the Pacific Coast Highway. She was bound and gagged with tape. Like Cindy Schaefer, she was taken to an isolated area in the mountains. Once there, the two men raped her several times. Norris said they left to go get beers. When he came back, Whitaker was alone and looking at Polaroids he had taken of Hall. He said he had stabbed her in both ears with an ice pick. He then strangled her. Once she was dead, he threw her body off a cliff. The pair waited 2 months before they killed again. On September 3rd, 1979, they picked up 13-year-old Lee Lamp and 15-year-old Jackie Gilliam while they were hitchhiking on the Pacific Coast Highway. They were bound and gagged. Unlike the first two victims, they were kept alive for 2 days. They endured a horrendous amount of torture. This time, Whitaker and Norris tape recorded the rape and torture. They took pleasure in hearing their victims' screams. Finally, Norris hit Lee several times on the head with a baseball bat. Whitaker then strangled her while Norris hit her in the head with a sledgehammer. Whitaker stabbed Jackie in both ears with an ice pick and then strangled her with a coat hanger. Then both bodies were thrown off a cliff. Then finally, they picked up 16-year-old Shirley Ledford as she was hitchhiking home from a Halloween party. Norris raped her while Whitaker struck her on the elbow 25 times with a sledgehammer. Norris also tortured her with a pair of pliers. Then finally, they strangled her with a coat hanger. Instead of hiding her body, they decided to leave it somewhere it could be easily found because they wanted to see how the media would react. After Norris confessed, Loris Whitaker was arrested. In February 1980, Norris took the police to the area where they had dumped the 4 bodies. They only found some bones belonging to Jackie Gilliam and Lee Lamp. There was an ice pick embedded in Jackie's skull. In March 1980, the district attorney made a plea deal with Roy Norris. If he testified against Whitaker, they would not seek the death penalty or life without parole. Instead, he would be given 45 years with a chance of parole after 30 years. Norris took the deal. Lawrence Whitaker went to trial in January 1981 for the murders of the 5 young women. The trial lasted 3 weeks and the jury deliberated for 3 hours. He was found guilty on all charges. He was then sentenced to death. Roy Norris was eligible for parole in 2009, but he didn't attend the hearing, so his parole was denied. He was allowed to apply again in 2019. Lawrence Whitaker was never executed. He died in prison of natural causes on December 13, 2019, at the age of 79. Norris was denied parole again in 2019. Like his partner, Norris died of natural causes in prison. He died on February 24, 2020, at the age of 72. Norris and Whitaker were nicknamed the Toolbox Killers. The remains of their first 2 victims, Cindy Schaefer and Andrea Hall, have never been found. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out our new channel, Paranormally Listed. There's a link on the screen now, and there's a link in the description box below this video. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.